Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve. Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo.
There's so much to love about this amazing show, and we're happy to connect to fans like us who discover new things with each rewatch.
Be advised, while we aren't gratuitous with spoilers, they can pop up as we discuss character arcs through the final season. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z.
This is Season 6, Episode 1, The Doorway, Part 1. This episode was written by Matthew Weiner and directed by Scott Hornbacher. It originally aired the same night as Episode 2, but we're going to break it down into two distinct parts for our discussion. The last episode takes place around Easter in 1967. This episode opens over winter vacation from December 1967 to January 1968. We open with another episode that plays with time a little bit. So it starts in New York with Don and Megan's doorman passing out, and then it cuts to Don and Megan on the beach.
We know how Don really likes California and feels like he's a different person when he's out there. I don't know if I get the sense that he feels like a different person in Hawaii, but it does have a surreal feeling.
I feel like Don reading from Dante's Inferno is really important for Season 6 overall. He says, "I went astray from the straight road and woke to find myself alone in a dark wood." And now is a good time to point out that the name Sylvia means of the wood. We'll get to that. And you're not alone, Don. You're right next to your beautiful young wife, and you're ignoring her. And if she spent her life waiting around for you and waiting on you like Betty, you would be ignoring her too, because we've seen that. So it makes sense Don is still wrestling with the condition of his soul and his sins, like the protagonist of Dante's Inferno. But it's really hard to watch him repeat these same destructive patterns. And that's the point. This isn't a man moving forward, no matter how much he tries to offer that advice to other people.
Why do you think Don's state of mind is up for grabs all the time? There's so much about his life that seems to be going so well.
It's hard to see it, isn't it? But I think the lesson is just you can't run from yourself. He doesn't love himself. He doesn't trust himself. He's not true to himself. And I hate to say this because I think she's very loving to him, but I don't know that Don ever did love Megan. I think he wants to. I think he wants to be the guy who loves Megan, but he knows the truth of it if he looks too carefully at it, so it's much easier to look away.
But I think if we reach that conclusion, we're really saying he's incapable of loving anyone else. For as fondly as he feels for his children, in many ways he's very absent. We know he was infatuated with Megan and excited about their relationship, and that seems to have worn off. It looks like he had that same feeling for Betty, and it wore off. Is Don Draper incapable of love in the fullest sense?
I think this whole first episode really establishes how disconnected Don is from his life. Megan loves getting away. She loves relaxing and drinking on the beach. We find out she has an acting job. Her bosses are worried if she's too tan or not. And Don is there, but he's not interacting with her at all. He doesn't actually say any words for the first, 10 minutes of the whole script, except for that voiceover.
Later in the hotel room, Megan has a joint, and I think this emphasizes the difference in their generations. Again, Megan is young and hip. She's of a new youth generation, and he's looking backwards and reflecting the past.
I thought maybe it was a little ungentlemanly of Don to make Megan go get the joints. I mean, but yes.
They'll think he's a cop, right?
Well, that's true. Megan seems very relaxed and very happy to be with Don, and they have sex, and Don still hasn't said anything. And along with this abrupt flashback from New York with the crisis that we just get a glimpse of, the whole thing has a dreamlike quality. It's like Don is watching his life unfold, and he's a puppet in it instead of a participant. And we've seen this before. We've seen these flashbacks or these dreamlike sequences. So I think as we're opening onto the season, if you were a first-time viewer, you would have a sense of wonder about whether this was happening or whether it was a dream.
And up to this point, one would assume that they're there on a vacation, but as they move to the luau scene, it's clear he's there on a work trip. They're being hosted so he can check out the Royal Hawaiian.
This hotel was built in 1927, and the luau show they're watching isn't about authentic traditions. It's full of kitsch, and they're trying to sell their self-guided tours. And it's funny that the fakeness of this seems unappealing to the ad guy. Don is pleasant enough, but this is not his scene. And it's almost like Fight Club. If he knows somebody else is faking it, it makes him uncomfortable, even though he's always faking it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be his jam at all, whereas Megan seems to be enjoying herself like she's supposed to as a tourist. She's happy to get up and do the hula dancing. This Royal Hawaiian feast is a bit of a fabrication for the tourist industry.
Yes, Megan is so happy. She's happy tanning on the beach. She's happy with sex in the hotel room. She's happy with the tourist show. She's not sitting there pondering her sins in hell on this trip. But if you watch all of this with the lens of Dante's Inferno, there are all these references to fire, the fire dancers and the torches and the lighter coming up in a later scene. So even though Don is in this beautiful paradise setting with his lovely wife, he's walking through a version of hell and he's surrounded but alone again.
And Megan getting recognized from her soap opera just seems to drive the point home again. We know Dawn is somewhat conflicted about her career and how that's taking her away from him. And we can see Megan is thrilled to have the success and to get the recognition from, some random person at the luau who recognizes her from her TV work.
And I don't detect any negativity from Don toward Megan, but he watches her on the stage and he sees her beauty and her happiness. And you can see he loves her as much as he can, but it's also distant. It's not a man who can't wait to get her back to the hotel room or he's beaming, about being able to make her so happy. And it's the same with the fan. He's tolerating it. He's not proud of Megan. He's just observing her being recognized. So I feel like there's some jealousy and judgment lurking.
Well, and he's so detached, even back in the hotel room. Again, Megan is full of enthusiasm. She's smoking a joint, and she says, "I love it here." And Dawn almost seems like a passenger throughout this early part of the episode.
This is a personal pet peeve, but I hate being from a Midwestern college town and having it represented as a hick backwater all the time. So this fan, this woman from Minnesota, she's shown to be so awkward and grating. And Megan says she didn't even know they had the show there. Fun fact, Megan, Minnesotans didn't even have TV until 2015. So Don wakes up in the middle of the night and goes down to the bar where he meets another stranger. And this keeps up the sense of whether all of this is a dream because Don typically talks more to strangers than to the people in his life. But this young drunk soldier is doing almost all the talking.
I was struggling a bit with trying to figure out what the point of this interaction is. PFC Dinkins is on leave from Vietnam. He alludes to the danger and the violence. The war's going to take a turn for the worse when the Tet Offensive is launched. But in this scene, it feels like, again, Dawn is the passenger. Is he another one of these guides hosting Dawn on his tour through the Inferno?
I do. I think the early episodes in every season set up the themes for Mad Men, so Dante's Inferno is this dark beginning. And also the fact that the first word Don says, except for his voiceover, is army. So maybe he is going to face some of the demons from his past and go back to where he tried to leave himself behind. But I share your sense of wonder. Whenever Don wanders off and talks to strangers, I have to force myself to stay into it a lot of the time. There are so many really great characters in the world of Mad Men, and I find those people interesting. So I shouldn't be so resistant to a new one. But I do have this whole, okay, why do we need to know this much about a soldier? I think it has to do with Don observing his life from afar. Here's a guy early in his relationship. He's getting married tomorrow. Don has played that possibility out a couple of times now, and it hasn't given him what he's looking for.
Well, and it feels like Dinkins calls him out at the end of the scene, too, when he says, Don is this veteran in paradise. the man who can't sleep and talking to strangers. So it seems like Dinkins is mirroring what we might feel as observers of the episode. What's Don's problem exactly? Because it feels, in terms of external cues, this place is paradise. So what's the problem?
And Dinkins has a line where he compares paradise to Vietnam. So you really can't escape it. So they definitely have that in common. I feel like it also reinforces the idea that this man, this soldier, has a fresh start where Don doesn't. And of course, they each have a lighter, and that connection comes up in a more significant way later on.
The other thing that it brings to mind for me a little bit is just we saw in the flashback when Don went to Korea, he was happy to go anywhere to get out of where he was from and that situation. He was running away from his reality growing up. But I wonder if Don, when he listens to Dinkins and contemplates how Dinkins finds himself in Vietnam and what he's going through, and I wonder if Don Draper compares and contrasts that a little bit.
Next, we see Megan waking up that morning, and she looks out the window and sees Don on the beach, helping to give the bride away at Dinkins' wedding. It's so much easier for him to step up for a stranger one time than it is to commit to a lifetime of a few people you really care about. That's the tragedy and the disconnect for Don.
He doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't really say anything. So again, he's a very passive figure in the wedding, which I suppose parallels his state of mind here in his own life. How can you be a passenger in your own life, especially someone with as much going on around him as we know Don Draper has, but yet somehow he's sitting in the passenger seat.
Next, we hear music from Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker and see Pauline, Sally, Betty, and Sally's friend Sandy in the theater. They're passing a bag of candy with individually rattling wrappers. I bet the people around them are really delighted to get to hear that. PSA, don't be the rattly candy unwrapper person when you go to the theater. And Betty skips the candy when it comes to her, so we can see she's still paying attention to her diet.
Driving back from the Nutcracker, and it's obviously cold outside. They've been pulled over by the police, so they have this, pesky administrative hassle. And it's all in total contrast to the bliss of paradise in Hawaii that we've just been at.
So Pauline invokes Henry's name to get them out of a traffic ticket. And the more we talk about them, the more I'm starting to be convinced that Betty and Pete are the same character in different bodies. They're both privileged and spoiled. They both want everybody to be jealous of them. And they're both lonely and spiteful. And in this particular scene, Betty giggles at Sally's friend's really dark joke, and it reminds me of Pete laughing with Don and Roger about the chewing gum. Betty loves being with the cool kids against Pauline here, just like Pete thought that they were all together against Lane.
It seems like a weird connection to me for Betty to make, to somehow identify with Sandy at this stage in her life, because it is so far in the rearview mirror of Betty's life. And I would think Betty would have more in common with Pauline.
But of course, she identifies with the younger person. Sandy is played by Karis Dorsey. She played the daughter in Ray Donovan and the daughter in Moneyball, and you may also recognize her from Brothers and Sisters. Pauline and Betty and Sally and Sandy return home, where Henry is watching Bobby and Jean. Sally takes about 2 seconds before telling on Betty for getting a ticket, and she's now calling her mother Betty. So we've seen her fighting madly to grow up, and she seems to be in full teenage swing here.
Given her talents with the violin, Sandy puts on the requisite violin show. She's apparently headed to Juilliard.
Yes, Sally's friend is playing Chopin's Nocturne in E flat. It's one of his most recognizable pieces, and it's such a combination of sweetness and sadness. And to me, it was very telling who allows themselves to be touched by the music, because Sally is busy being blasé. That's pretty much her life performance right now. And Pauline listens, but there's no beauty there for her. It's Henry and Bobby who let themselves love the moment. And Betty is two people. I think she admires Sandy and her undeniable talent, but she's also noticing how impressed Henry and Bobby are. And it's always unsettling for Betty Draper not to be the favorite. I think the most relatable thing Sandy says to Betty is her insistence that 15 isn't a prodigy. Betty feels like her best days are behind her, and Sandy is only 15, but she's already looking back and seeing opportunities she's lost. So Betty can empathize with Sandy in a way she never can with Sally, because Sally's life always reflects on Betty's success raising her. So Betty never sees Sally as an individual or tries to understand her own daughter. The violin music continues as we see Megan and Don returning from Hawaii in the cold New York winter. And there's this flashback again to clarify what we saw at the beginning. Jonesy collapses, Arnold is the one who steps in and takes charge. Don is impressed, even though he feels a little small, maybe like Betty with Sandy. Jonesy has been referred to before in the series, but this is his first appearance. He's played by Ray Abruzzo, and you may have seen him in Dynasty way back when, or as Carmine in The Sopranos, or in The Practice or Transparent.
I think the implication for this scene for Don, though, is he gets a flash of mortality in this instance. We're all that close to something similar happening. Your life could be over. Where are you in life? What are you doing?
It's so true when we think about why our friends and family might not stick with this series. Maybe because the season opens with a focus on death, and it's kind of a little bit depressing. But yes, it's true. It really permeates this episode and maybe even this season, this idea that, what do you have to show for your life?
Well, and it feels very representative of a reality that I think many of us experience, where you go through a period where nobody is dying or has died for a while, and it kind of gets pushed into the back seat and you don't notice it. And then something happens to bring it forward again, and you realize, oh gosh, we're all mortal. I guess I like that because I do feel this is what happens to people. You don't think about your health until it's in jeopardy or it's compromised in some way. And same thing with mortality.
Arnold Rosen, this doctor, is played by Brian Markinson. He has a very long resume, including appearances in The L Word, The Killing, Continuum, and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, starring Kiernan Shipka, who of course plays Sally.
The next scene has Betty and Henry in bed after the evening with the violin playing, and the dialogue goes down this odd path of a sort of rape fantasy. It feels a little off for me because I just don't imagine Betty speaking this way.
It's a standout of disturbing things in the whole series. And Matthew Weiner describes this as Betty's sense of humor and her trust in Henry to be able to joke like this. It's just so unbelievably icky. I think viewers are so horrified at what Betty says that they aren't getting anything valuable about the strength of Betty's relationship with Henry from the scene. I almost wonder if she's also trying to mimic Sandy, who made a dark joke about her mother being dead in the car earlier, to take something uncomfortable, meaning Henry's admiration of Sandy, and then trying to laugh about it.
Maybe that's a charitable interpretation here that Betty has taken it too far too quickly.
Well, and Henry, to his credit, is not impressed either. There's no defending this. It's terrible. I suppose you could say there are things family members joke about in private that are awful that they would never say in public. Weiner says this is here to show Betty isn't just a cookie-cutter 50s TV wife. And again, I'm so disappointed for her that she's not about her appearance or damaging her children. So now Betty's divergence from the predictable is something horrific. Even Pete gets to be occasionally sympathetic. So they did her dirty.
Back in Dawn and Megan's apartment, and Megan talks about reviewing a script where her role has been cut down to a single scene, and she mentions that she shouldn't have gone on vacation. This is happening in the context of we know her role was going pretty well and people were getting to know her.
My take was, as much as Megan loved everything about their vacation, now she regrets the cost to her career. I don't want to say she's quick to throw away her happiness with Dawn, because that's not entirely true. But we can see how much she values her job and her work life and her success. And of course, we would expect that. Don has some cursory responses, but he's not very invested in Megan's concerns about her work. So we can see this is an ongoing source of friction, even if they're not making any pointed remarks to each other or having an all-out war about it.
Back at the Francis residence, Betty's gotten up in the middle of the night to find Sandy in the kitchen. They seem to have a fairly candid conversation between each other, and it seems like Betty identifies with Sandy and is happy to speak with her, less as a mother figure and more as a friend or somebody who can understand her struggles. Sandy was actually rejected from Juilliard and doesn't really have a traditional or an approved plan of what to do next.
I've never been a huge fan of this particular storyline. It's like Don and Dinkins in the bar late at night, only instead we get Betty and Sandy in the kitchen in the middle of the night, so it's a relative stranger looking to illuminate yourself. If I look at this plot line as what Betty feels she missed out on, it's helpful, but it's still imperfect. So Betty relating to Sandy, she's got talent and dreams, she's lost her mom, she's restless with her current condition, all those things are parallel. And Sandy has this line about, I'm old for a violinist, in 2 years it'll be too late. And she talks about the futility of getting married. And it felt like a callback of when Betty said to her psychiatrist, the thing about being beautiful to find a man and then what? Just sit and smoke and let it go till you're in a box. And Sandy seems to understand the unhappiness quotient of that plan a lot sooner than Betty did.
Yeah, it does seem to strike close to home with Betty. But I don't get the sense that Sandy was seeking to make a personal attack on Betty, just that Sandy was rejecting the path that Betty had ended up embracing and following.
Sandy goes on to talk about some kids she saw in the city and they were, quote, just living and it's beautiful. And this is December of 1967, so the US has just been through the summer of love. So this whole thing about the peace-loving hippie culture and idealistic young people, kids are unhappy with the world the adults before them have put into place, but in trying to solve those issues, they sometimes create new ones to be solved by the generations that come after. Betty is not very receptive to Sandy's take. You're a kid, you don't know, wait till you're older. And she's consistently given that message to Sally as well.
I think this is Betty reverting back to that older role model position, and then also just the blind idealism of Sandy, of, just living free and this and that. Not that Betty has so much experience with wanting and not having, but it looks like she had a bit of exposure to it during her modeling, as she reveals in this scene. And she's certainly not this starry-eyed idealist that Sandy is at this point. And I think Betty's advice to her at this point is sound advice. Get through high school, know yourself better, and you'll be in a better position to make these types of big decisions that are going to have major repercussions for you. Of course, Sandy, being young, doesn't seem to have much appetite for that advice.
Next, we get a look at Peggy and Abe returning to her apartment after a night out. There's a Christmas tree up, and it's the holiday season. But we don't see Peggy with her mother or sister after her mother was so outraged to hear Peggy was moving in with Abe. This is a spoiler, but we don't see Peggy's mother or sister again in the series. I think Peggy references her sister in Jerry's car later on. But it isn't clear if Peggy and her mother are permanently estranged now, or maybe they see each other in obligatory visits, but Peggy seems to have left a lot of her past behind, not unlike her mentor.
The account man calls the creative genius Peggy here and tries to throw the problem into her lap. And we can see that although Peggy's not at work, this is after hours, Peggy embraces that reality. It is her problem. She's going to have to figure out what to do here. Peggy very much seems to have grown into Don Draper's shoes.
The particular problem has to do with a headphones ad for the upcoming Super Bowl. And there's some noise in the fandom about how this is inaccurate because it wasn't officially called the Super Bowl for a couple of years. The first one had been the prior January in 1967, so we're talking about the second one. Both of them were officially called the World Championships, but the name Super Bowl started with the team owner and it spread, and we'll link an article about that on our website. Now when Don runs into Arnold in the elevator, we can place him as the neighbor who saved the doorman's life. Don invites Arnold to stop by, and he'll give him a Leica camera from their supply closet. And this relationship is weird for Don Draper because it looks like friendship, and Don does not have friends. This is somebody he seems to care about. He cares about his opinion. He genuinely seems to like him. That's the first time we've ever seen that.
Well, and we've got the men bonding over tech, and that seems to be something that men like to bond over. It's a fun little time capsule here because Japanese cameras are just coming into their own in the late 60s, and they are world beaters.
I will say, I think you can make a case for Roger being Don's friend, but their business need for each other is so entwined, it's hard to be sure that that's real. And I also have to be suspicious about whether Don is just being nice to cover his tracks about a reveal we get later in this episode. But I do think he's genuinely interested in an honest friendship with Arnold, and it's so unusual to see him try that I think it's notable.
Yeah, I don't see it as such a major reach to establish a friendship here. It feels like small talk. Giving away a camera is nothing to Don.
I really disagree. I think this is the only time in the series we see him. And I agree this particular scene isn't so notable, but what's coming up with this guy, and it's unusual. So I'm so suspicious of him. Like, Don, what's your motive? Because you don't act like this. You don't have interest in anybody else. You don't have any interest in your wife in Hawaii. So why Arnold? But I think it has to do with this life and death thing he has going on. And for whatever reason, Arnold really has his eye.
The next scene takes us to Roger talking to his therapist. And it's kind of a monologue from Roger as he riffs on the meaning of life. Doors, bridges, and gates all open the same way. They close behind you. He seems to feel that, your experiences are supposed to change you, but at some point that ceases to be true. You've had the experiences, you are who you are, and now you just run out the clock until you're dead. He tries to engage with the therapist and get him to laugh, and the therapist makes it clear he's not there to laugh at his jokes and things. I think he wants something out of the therapist, but he's not getting it. And part of the problem with that is Roger doesn't really want to get too deep into what's bothering him. He'd rather riff on it in a charming, amusing way and have an audience.
Absolutely. I guess psychiatry isn't just 1960s candy pink stove after all, is it, Roger? I'm glad to see him in therapy. I think it's needed. And the two things that stand out to me here are the psychiatrist pointing out how Roger uses humor to avoid the truth, which he's done since we've met him. And then this monologue that ties back to the episode title about experiences being doorways. We do have a truth call out in this particular scene. These things happen to you, they're supposed to change you, but that's not true. This is kind of a judgy take, but I know some people who travel widely, and when they come home, they're unchanged. They don't see the magic of the statues in the Borghese Gallery and feel transformed. And I believe in Roger's capacity to be transformed, so I disbelieve what he is saying about new experiences not doing anything for him. It's a callback to what Don said to Rachel about love being a mirage just invented by ad men. I didn't believe him then either. I think Roger is afraid of not feeling something deeply, so he pretends he doesn't feel anything.
This is a bit of a turn from Roger, too, because after his LSD experience, it seemed that a burden had been lifted from him, and he was in a better mental place, looking forward to new experiences, freed himself from his marriage to Jane. He's hooked up with Marie. And yet here in this scene, it feels like he's sliding back into his midlife crisis, depression.
Even though it's the holidays, Peggy shows up to meet with Bert about the headphones problem. They found a young guy who watched The Tonight Show, and he tries to imitate the comedian's bit. And Bert Peterson is useless because he didn't really understand the problem and he didn't see the show. And he thinks it's a crisis, but he's still laughing at this junior guy's performance in the conference room. So it doesn't feel like he's taking it seriously. I don't know. He's not very helpful.
Well, I think what he's representing is the account perspective on this. So he knows it is an issue with the client, but it's creative's problem. So creative needs to come back with a solution, and then Bert can go pitch that and try and get the client on side. In the meantime, as the accounts guy, yeah, I think he's perfectly happy to laugh along and separate that from the work challenge.
Just for context, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was at its peak in the 70s and 80s, but even by this point, an episode would find a wide audience. Obviously, there weren't so many other forms of competing on-demand media then, so people would have the same exposure to fewer shows, and a comedian's bit on The Tonight Show would be a lot more memorable, and of course, they don't want this association.
Yeah, and we can also see the reference to Vietnam and coming up in a very unflattering light. The idea of American soldiers committing atrocities in Vietnam and having poor conduct. There's several references to, did they really say that or speak of this? I thought they didn't say VC on the show, etc. So we can see that despite all the efforts to keep the lid on the Vietnam War, it is increasingly intruding. You can't sanitize a major conflict, a major war like Vietnam. And the attempt to sanitize it to this point is failing. And they're sliding over a cliff in which is going to profoundly change the country. And, just the leading edge of this is now bumping into Peggy's campaign for the headphones. That there's so much happening there. And as much as people might want to avoid looking at it won't be ignored.
And Abe, of course, would be outraged by this, where Peggy takes a beat. So she's very work focused, but on hearing this, she takes a beat to say, they really did that? So it's not that she stops and drops everything to join Abe in protest, but it punches through. Next, we're introduced to Bob Benson. I think immediately we can draw parallels to Don Draper with their alliterative names, their good-looking charmers who act like they belong. So it makes sense that Bob Benson's first scene is with Don.
Yeah, and Bob just reeks of ambition. So he gets 2 coffees so that he can give one of the coffees to whoever might come along and want it. I think we've all bumped into people like Bob, and I think people like Don Draper can see him from a mile off as well.
He plays it just right. He tries too hard. When Don makes a comment about it, like, what's in your coffee? He has a reasonable answer. And the first episode in each season of Mad Men introduces us to new people and situations, and we're supposed to just keep up. So we're conditioned to get to know new characters, but nobody else knows Bob either, so you can already feel something is off about him. Bob Benson is played by James Wolk. You might recognize him as the junior coach in The Boys in the Boat, or from Ordinary Joe, Zoo, or The Crazy Ones.
As Don walks into the bullpen, he sees the creative team busy smoking pot. Stan follows up on Don's trip to the Royal Hawaiian and tries to get a jump on whatever the experience or impressions were. But Don is singularly unhelpful and merely replies that he had an experience, but he doesn't know how to put it in words. Well, hey, Don Draper, that's what you're paid to do.
Yeah, that's a problem for the words guy. But we trust he will eventually get there. And it's an interesting line since Roger is telling his psychiatrist that experiences are nothing and they don't change you, and Don is claiming the opposite here. I was going to say that, remember Paul Kinsey at least used his mohair sweater to try to block the smell of marijuana from seeping under the door. Now they barely put their joints away before the partner comes in.
Well, and I thought it was interesting in the commentary there where they were talking about their advertising advisor saying that at this time, even with clients in the office, they actually embraced smoking marijuana in the office and having the smell of it because that seemed to reflect this hip, new, creative freedom, that was being driven by the young generation.
I want to share a quick call out about Margie in this scene, played by Tracy Silver. You may have seen her on Goliath, Yellow Jackets, or Hacks. The Topaz client mentioned in the prior episode how they used to have a female perspective about their creative work after Peggy left, and now, of course, they do. We can already see Margie as one of the guys. They're being really rude to her. She has some kind of argument or bet running with Ginsburg, and she's pretty unruffled by their demeanor, so she seems to be fitting right in. As Don approaches his office, the partners are having their photos taken, and Harry doesn't say anything, but he stomps up the stairs in the middle of the photo shoot. We know he's really irritated he's not a partner and he feels overlooked. And we also learn from this that SCDP did expand to the second floor as planned, so business is booming.
And then I think another hallmark of how things have changed in the office happens when Pete asks Don about Sheraton and reminds him that they're presenting on Friday. Don tries to blow him off, but Pete isn't to be put off that easily. And he takes a couple shots at Don about taking naps and how he works. But I think the point of the shots is to just emphasize something needs to be done. Don is the man to get it done, and Pete is holding him accountable for it. So it's one of the most blatant scenes, I think, where we can see the ascendancy of Pete in the office, and the fact that he's pushing Don Draper is not something we've seen a lot of prior to this point.
When Don goes into his office, the camera crew has moved his furniture around for the photo shoot, which irks him. Even in his office, things are out of place. And we've seen this discontent from Don Draper before, but here he looks out the window with his back to camera, and you can hear the ocean surf. Since he didn't seem particularly joyful or inspired while he was away in Hawaii, we know he's not thinking about this as a happy memory. It's not that he wishes he could go back to vacationing with Megan. This is a lot more somber.
And as he looks out the window and we just see the cityscape behind him, I think it raises the question of where is he in the grand scheme of things, and who is he? And the condition of his office, it's familiar, but it's changed, and it's not organized the way perhaps he would ideally like it to be. That seems like a good metaphor for his own state of mind.
I think part one might officially end here, but we're going to push a little farther into this two-part episode because there's a lot to discuss in the back half of it. Next, we see Peggy meeting with the Koss Headphones clients. She tries to reassure them the comedian set is not a problem, but it's clear they want new work, and it'll have to be fast. And this whole scene is set up to show how Peggy has grown in her people management. She's not dictating to the clients, she lets them feel heard. But their disagreement isn't irritating her. She expects it, she's ready to handle it. She's in control, and she's still committed to doing great creative work. She doesn't just want to go with the first easy idea. It's really Peggy in her element.
And here I think we see a bit of a contrast, because in the past, we've certainly seen some serious friction between Don Draper and clients, especially when the client was reflexively reverting back to safe, cliched presentations of their product. We've seen Peggy snap at that as well. Here, it feels like the client is doing that, but Peggy is pretty professional and seems to do a pretty good job of talking the client down. She's trying to buy time here because she doesn't know what the new idea is. And we can see the client is really on the fence, but ultimately concedes in the end. And I think that's a success for Peggy in the moment.
Next, we get Don working through creative problems with his team, which is a nice juxtaposition to the scene with Peggy doing the same. They both have a lot of confidence and at the same time, understanding that it's a process. It's going to take some time to get through. So Arnold comes to visit the office, and he's seeing Don being good at his job. I find it really funny how Don is criticizing everything they have and going to lengths to explain why they can't use any of it. And then Arnold shows up and Don goes, "We're finishing up. These are great."
I think we see the respect that Arnold has for Don and his work, and he can see that, this is why Don Draper, is a big wheel in the advertising business. And I think for Don, in a way, he's kind of showing off some of the perks of his job.
As they talk together, Don tells Arnold, "Don't compare what you do to what I do." And he's rarely that self-deprecating. We see a little self-deprecation when he says goodbye to Freddie in 6-month leave, when Freddie tells him, "You're talented." But not very often. That it's so unique for Don to have a friend come by. Don's secretary assumes Arnold is Don's doctor, and then he has to explain, "Oh no, Arnold's here as a friend." We find out their wives are planning a New Year's Eve celebration, and they're happy as long as it's in the building and casual. It might be the first social event that's not a date or work that Don isn't trying to avoid.
Yeah, he does seem amenable to getting together in the building, which is a little off-brand for him.
Roger's other favorite therapy is young women, so we see him on the phone with someone who doesn't even get a name or a face when his secretary Caroline comes in. She gives him the news that his mother has passed away. And while she starts sobbing, he remains very matter of fact and he cracks some jokes. I don't see this as a selfish outburst on Caroline's part here because even though Roger ends up comforting her, I feel like he's reacting so oddly that she expresses the grief she expects from him. And this actress has such comedic timing. Only on Mad Men could this news be a comedic moment.
Yeah, it's a funny switch here where it seems Roger is comforting her that his mother has died. But I think Roger's reaction in the moment makes sense a bit. You know, Roger's pretty selfish. His mother was very elderly, and he's got to have been expecting sooner or later something like this is going to happen. And we know he's wrapped up with his own angst about his life and place in the universe. So it feels like someone's thrown a rock in the pond, and there are ripples which will reach the shore. But in the immediate moment, there's really nothing emotional out of Roger. It's very humorous when he's rubbing her back while holding both her glass and his glass in his hand.
On Mad Men, whether it's good news or difficult news, it's usually cause for a drink. So when Roger offers it, Caroline downs it. When he's alone, Roger looks up and he toasts with his own drink. And then he looks down. And that's a necessary moment because this news does affect him and he does care. And this is like what the psychiatrist was saying, of course, where he's using humor to paper over the truth of his feelings. I did think a little bit with all the parent-child relationships we see on this show. I'm a little surprised at this moment that we haven't seen more of Roger with his mother. But I suppose we don't really need it because it's so easy to connect the dots to Roger's self-doubt with his father's success and his entitlement based on his mother's affection. That's all very present.
It really does seem in Mad Men that the opening episode of a given season is putting the pieces in place for some of the larger themes that we're going to get in the season. So I think the first part of this two-part episode spends a lot of time setting those pieces up. It seems to me like we're off to a fairly dark start to season 6.
And this is where we're going to end part 1, although part 2 definitely gives us more about all the setup we've seen so far. Our listener shout out today goes to Amy, Kelly, Sylvia, and Stella. Thank you for following our Mad Men C to Z Instagram account. And we appreciate the comments, the 5-star ratings, the follows from everybody who's been supporting us. Thank you so much to our listeners for taking time to rewatch with us.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctoz.com, to vote for your favorite Sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at MadmenC2Z, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.